In the skies over northern England in January of 1971 is an Avro Vulcan bomber carrying out a routine training mission. What began as a routine mission for the crew will rapidly turn into a struggle for their very survival and place the residents and school children of the village of Wingate, County Durham, in serious danger. Thursday the 7th of January 1971 at RAF Waddington in Lincolnshire, England, the 5-man crew of Avro Vulcan XM610 are preparing for a routine sortie. The aircraft is a B2 variant of the Vulcan, belonging to 44 Squadron of the Royal Air Force. The squadron had been operating the Avro Vulcan since the 10th of August 1960, with the introduction of the B1 variant. But this was upgraded to the B1A in January 1961, and this in turn was upgraded to the latest B2 variant in September of 1966. Initially, the Avro Vulcan was developed to deliver nuclear weapons deep into Soviet territory, but following the transfer of the UK's nuclear deterrence to the Royal Navy, 44 Squadron came under the command of the NATO Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. The Vulcan's war role had now been reassigned to tactical strike missions using low-level penetration in the support of Allied forces repelling Soviet forces attempting an invasion into Western Europe. Likely targets were enemy infrastructure and troop concentrations, delivering either conventional weapons or, if required, tactical nuclear weapons. The sortie of the 7th of January 1971 was to simulate just such a mission. The aircrew consisted of Captain Flight Lieutenant Garth Robert Alcock, with Flying Officer Peter Hoskins as his co-pilot. In the rear was the Air Electronics Operator Flight Lieutenant Jim Power, Navigation Plotter Flight Lieutenant Jim Vinale, and Flying Officer Roger Barker operating the navigation radar. Following departure from RAF Waddington, the route for the sortie would take them at high altitude up the North Sea coast, towards the far north of England and the Scottish borders. The terrain of the northern Pennines and the Cheviot Hills was ideal for a low-level simulated penetration attack runs, and following this they would climb back to high altitude and head out over the North Sea, turning south for recovery back to RAF Waddington. The journey north was straightforward enough. The aircraft was performing as expected, and everything was in place ready for the low-level activity. There were no indications whatsoever of the life-threatening drama that was about to unfold. With the border region approaching, Alcock descended his aircraft and entered the north of England low-flying zone. The superb handling and manoeuvrability of the Vulcan came into its own now, as it made its way through the Pennines and the Cheviot Hills at a speed of 300 knots and a mere 500 feet off the ground. Flying at such a low altitude was essential in avoiding detection by enemy radar. The mission was proceeding exactly as planned, and up to this point, the winter weather, which in the north of England can be as unpredictable as it can be unforgiving, had been fine with good visibility. However, with the Vulcan flying in the area of Kelso, Flight Lieutenant Alcock could see up ahead that this was about to change. With cloud forming at low level and visibility reducing, low-level flying of this nature was now breaching safety limitations. Alcock had no hesitation in bringing the low-level portion of the mission to an end. Informing the crew of his decision, he increased the power of his 4 engines to 85% and pulled his Vulcan skywards and began preparations for the high-level recovery back to Waddington. What happened next would, in a second, change the sortie from a routine mission to a fight for survival. With the engines powering the aircraft away from the terrain below, a loud explosion was heard, followed immediately by a violent yaw to the left. A startled Alcock immediately began scanning his instruments to try and get an indication of what had just happened. In a glance, he saw that his number 1 engine RPM indicator was winding down, whilst at the same time, the number 1 jet pipe temperature indicator was rising rapidly. No sooner had he saw this, the number 1 engine fire warning lit up. Calling his crew to initiate the engine fire drill, he closed the high-pressure fuel cock and pulled back the throttle control to the number 1 engine, and then activated the fire extinguisher. In the rear, the air electronics operator Jim Power reported that the alternator on the number 1 engine had failed. Looking through his rear-facing periscope, he also reported to Alcock that in the area of the number 1 engine, there was damage to the airframe. The engine alternator was shut down and isolated, and for a moment at least, it looked like the danger had been contained. With the fire seeming to be extinguished and the fire warning light no longer lit, Flight Lieutenant Alcock continued his climb to altitude on the remaining 3 engines, all the while scanning his panel for any further problems. It wasn't long before problems returned. The jet pipe temperature indication on engine number 2 was rising fast. The number 2 engine fire warning light lit up. Alcock and his crew were now back in danger. Fearing that he could lose vital power and hydraulics to his aircraft, Alcock deployed the Ram air turbine, a small windmill that drops into the airflow and generates enough power for vital aircraft systems. This, unfortunately, also has the effect of cutting all non-essential systems from the aircraft power. His panel was now blinking and flashing everywhere he looked. The fire drill was recommenced for engine number 2, and the engine was shut down, isolated, and the fire extinguisher activated. With both port side engines now shut down, and both starboard engines at climb power, the crippled Vulcan was yawing considerably to the left and required a bootful of rudder from Alcock to keep it straight. In the rear, the 3 crew members were frantically going about their emergency procedures. The nav plotter, Jim Vanale, had calculated as accurate a position as possible to enable Alcock to transmit his Mayday radio message. Following the Mayday transmission, a Westland Whirlwind search and rescue helicopter of 202 Squadron from nearby RAF Boomer was scrambled. With the Vulcan only operating on emergency power supplied by the Ram air turbine, Flight Lieutenant Power had run up the Airborne Auxiliary Power Unit to give further power supplies. Whilst he was reconnecting various aircraft systems, his attention was drawn to an orange glow inside the periscope. To his horror, whereas previously there was some visual airframe damage in the area of the number 1 engine, there was now a fire raging around both port side engines. No sooner had this information been passed to the captain, Alcock issued the order, "Put on parachutes and prepare to bail out." Vulcan rear crew members did not have ejection seats. The weather was now quite cloudy and the aircraft was enveloped in cloud, and because of this, the moment to bail out had to be delayed until such a time that they were in clear skies. Soon enough, at 6,000 feet and over the village of Rothbury, Vulcan X-ray Mike 610 broke through the cloud tops into clear sky. It was time for the rear crew to abandon their aircraft. The crew prepared their emergency equipment and tightened down their helmets. Vanale initiated the cabin depressurization, and one by one they called out, "Ready." Alcock gave the order no Vulcan rear crew ever wants to hear. Static line, manual override, jump, jump. Flying Officer Roger Barker grabbed the door opening handle and moved it into the emergency position. A deafening roar and clouds of dust revealed the outside world passing by at 200 knots. Barker was up first. He sat on the sill, pulled his knees tight up to his chest and into a tight ball. He slid down the door and away from the aircraft. Within a second, he was surrounded by silence and hanging from his deployed parachute. Following him out of the aircraft was Jim Power and then Jim Vanale. All 3 made a safe landing in fields near Rothbury, and within minutes were joined by the Whirlwind search and rescue helicopter. Their emergency was over, but for Alcock and Hoskins, there was more to come. The main diversionary airfield was RAF Leeming in North Yorkshire, and at this moment it was some 70 miles away. But with the Vulcan at 6,000 feet and just 2 crew remaining on board, Alcock made the decision to attempt the diversion to Leeming. The route would take his Vulcan over the built-up areas of Tyneside and the city of Newcastle upon Tyne, and so he carefully manoeuvred a path as much as possible away from the built-up areas. Just to the south of Newcastle, and as he was passing Sunderland, he made another assessment of the situation. A lower speed handling test was carried out, but the aircraft quickly became unstable, and so he increased the speed back up to maintain control. Realising that a landing would be uncontrollable, he concluded that the aircraft was doomed. He turned the Vulcan towards the coastline with the intention of ejecting over the North Sea. With the aircraft passing over the village of Easington, they began ejection procedures. Both Alcock and Hoskins grabbed their respective canopy jettison levers and pulled. A loud bang saw their canopy whipped away, and the terrifying sight of a huge fire ablaze over the port wing engine area was now revealed. Alcock gave his order to his co-pilot to eject. Hoskins wasted no time. He grabbed his seat pan handle and pulled. A second later, he was shot from the blazing Vulcan. The aircraft was now on a path over the village of Wingate, County Durham. The school children of Wingate were quite used to low-flying military aircraft, and at first, the sound of an approaching jet was nothing out of the ordinary. As the Vulcan got closer, however, it became apparent that this was no ordinary flyover. The children and teachers could now see the flames enveloping the rear of the aircraft. It roared overhead as the children from Wingate Junior School and Wellgate Grammar School raced outside to see it disappear over the rooftops. Confident that X-ray Mike 610 was on a course to the sea, Alcock reached for his ejection handle and pulled. Within a second, he was fired out of the cockpit, and 2 seconds later, his seat had separated from him and he was hanging from his parachute. Alcock and Hoskins had both safely left their stricken Vulcan, but disastrously, the aircraft, rather than remain on its trajectory towards the North Sea, pitched up alarmingly, stalled, and then spiralled down into the ground. It impacted the ground in fields just to the south of the Wingate schools and close to the neighbouring village of Station Town. Miraculously, no one on the ground was hurt, but if the crash had occurred just a few seconds earlier, or slightly to the left or to the right, the loss of life and potentially the lives of numerous school children would have been catastrophic. The inquiry into the accident determined that a turbine blade within the No. 1 engine had failed due to fatigue. The damaged blade had then jammed within the spinning disc and caused enormous damage to the turbine casing, causing it to rupture. There then followed complete turbine failure, and the high-speed debris caused severe damage to the No. 2 engine as well as No. 3 and No. 4 fuel tanks. Despite the best efforts of Alcock and his crew, there was never anything that could have been done to save the aircraft. As a result of the inquiry, all Vulcans were modified with titanium armour plates within the engine bays to contain any damage from a failing engine and prevent damage to neighbouring engines or fuel tanks. Flight Lieutenant Alcock was awarded the Air Force Cross in recognition of his heroic attempts to save his crew and his aircraft. Flying Officer Hoskins, Flight Lieutenant Jim Power, Flight Lieutenant Jim Vinale and Flying Officer Roger Barker all received the Queen's Commendation for valuable service in the air. Alcock also went on to win RAF Man of the Year for 1971. Thanks very much for watching. Please hit the like button and consider subscribing.